Also appearing, Robert De Niro, who directed Cordero in a Bronx Tale. But he left way too soon. His fellow Broadway stars making one significant change to the end of these lyrics. Instead of this one, this guy will be one of the great ones. Yes, this guy will be one of the great ones. And thanks so much for watching tonight. GMA in the morning. David here back tomorrow night on Tommy Allen's New York. Stay safe. Good night. Stars is back. All happening live in the fall. The cast is epic, inspired.
That's the right one.
Better to get back to the city you love. It's also the first step you can take to protect yourself and your loved ones. Getting tested is quick, safe, easy, and free. Back in the 1950s, where no self-detected hospice locally, get tested. Visit nyc.gov/COVID-test to find a location near you.
The right one. Hello, hello.
Hello,
All right. Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Good, excellent. That's the way it's supposed to work. All right, always good when it works out that way. All right, so we'll be starting in a minute here. Again, last week I started 10 minutes late. This time I ran out of time, so all good. So the subject of today's class is going to be Poland in the interwar period. And, again, I think that it's a time where probably a lot of our ideas about Poles and Poland begin to be developed. There's a family there. But, to a great extent, as is often the case, we were only getting one part of the story. And I think the essential thing for understanding Jewish history, is the need to look not just at, the point of contact between Jews and the larger society, but to look at what's going on more broadly in that larger society as well, and you often find a little more nuance. So with that, let's begin here. You see this? See the PowerPoint thing here? All available? Okay. So I'm on PowerPoint. There we go. All right. So you see my slides? Yes. All good. Someone want to confirm? Yes. All right. Good. All right. So look, sometimes when it comes to teaching history or learning history, it's like important to sort of leave what you know, right? Like sometimes, when you want to understand mindsets in the past, you really have to, take a completely different look at things and take yourself out of the world we live in. Sometimes it's useful to understand the degree to which, it's one of those things, Mark Twain didn't actually say it, but he said it close enough. History doesn't repeat itself, but it stutters, right? There are enough similarities often between human motivations, right? History doesn't repeat itself, but human motivations, human fears, human desires repeat themselves, and that's why we often see the same thing again and again. So I want to, you can read on, but present to you a description of a country here.
Oh, yeah.
All right. People who see themselves. So I want to say again.
David, could you ask everyone to please mute their mics?
Yeah. So if you can hear my voice right now, and again, use your discretion, but mute your Zoom, because again, I don't have control of that because I set this up, and it would just be, menschlich to people who are here. So, all right. Anyway, so if I can hear you. So to reiterate, if there is noise coming through from your phone or your computer, if you could mute that, that would be great. Thank you. All right. People who see themselves as a uniquely persecuted nation, whose land was stolen from them, find themselves victimized by more powerful nations in whose borders they find themselves. For years, they conducted a nationalist movement that wins sympathy from Western liberals, and then finally, after a world war that transforms borders and power structures, an American president with his eyes on American political demographics pledges his support for the rebirth of their country. Their country is reborn with the blessing of the international community, but the nation needs to fight for survival not only against its national neighbors, but against their local neighbors who have no interest in being ruled by them. Not only does the nation succeed, but its borders are far larger than was initially allotted to them. That victory is mitigated, however, by the fact that they remain surrounded by powerful states who want not merely revenge, but to see them disappear. That far from being ethnically homogenous, the new state is a huge minority population, many of whom far prefer the rule of their nation. Subsequent policies consequently will be designed to socially and economically strengthen the majority population, often at the expense of minorities, but at the same time making sure that the minorities don't pose a political challenge nor aid the hostile foreign powers. What country that you certainly all are aware of and perhaps know and love, would you say that this describes?
Poland.
Poland, but what else? What other country? What?
Israel.
Israel, right? Good. All right. So, look, one of the things that's always interesting is we often in the Jewish community have this tendency to sort of think, oh, Israel's conditions are unique, right? No other country has to go through these things or has gone through these things. The fact is, there actually are these very striking analogies between interwar Poland and the state of Israel, certainly in its first decades. And we'll look at some of that as we go along, but it's something important to keep in mind, right? That while certainly there is anti-Semitism and so forth in Poland in this period, there also are these sort of specific nationalist characteristics that we tend to make excuses for when it comes to Israel, and I would just suggest maybe keep an open mind when it comes to Poland as well. So a little background of the Great War, right? When the Great War breaks out, World War I, it's a time of tremendous crisis and opportunity for the idea of Poland and for the people who live there. Right? Certainly for Jews, it begins initially as a disaster. As you mentioned, Poland had been divided up into three different sort of parts. For the Jews living in the German parts, right, they were fine, right? No real serious invasions there. For the Jews living in Austrian Poland or Galicia, it was a disaster. Galicia was a place where Jews were not persecuted. Jews certainly saw themselves as citizens of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And they now find themselves victims of a Russian invasion and occupation that brings with it tremendous instability and violence in general, but also specifically to the Jews of Galicia, right? I mean, if you're a Cossack who's accustomed to, mistreating the Jews of Russia, you're certainly not going to have too many objections to mistreating the Jews of Austria-Hungary. And a lot of Jews are stuck there. A lot of Jews flee, right? Something like 100,000 Jews flee Galicia, 100,000 plus in 1914, many of them making their way to Vienna. Among them, Sarah Schneerer, who, again, is later on going to found the Beis school system as one of these Galician refugees. So for the Jews of Austro-Hungarian Poland, the war begins certainly as a disaster. Same thing with the Jews in Russian Poland, right? Even though Russia is at first advancing, Jews were viewed as disloyal. There's a certain irony here in that Jews who for decades, for a century or so, had been highly restricted in terms of leaving the western parts of the Russian Empire are now actually moved into the interior by the Russian government precisely because they're viewed as suspect, right? They'd rather have the Jews in Russia than in places like Ukraine or Poland where they might provide aid to the enemy. But by 1916, things have really flipped, right? The Central Powers have gone on the offensive. Galicia is reconquered. Congress Poland, or the Kingdom of Poland, the Russian part of Poland is occupied by the Germans and Austrians. And, for those who obviously associate German military in Poland with certain negative consequences for the Jews, during the Great War, it was just the opposite. Jewish soldiers, there were large numbers of Jewish soldiers in the Austrian and German militaries. The German Jewish community, and it's kind of cool actually on the lower right hand, it's a Rosh Hashanah card from 1914 showing a Jewish Austrian soldier embracing a Jewish German soldier. There's a Hanukkah party featuring German and Austro-Hungarian Jewish soldiers on the upper left hand there. But yeah, the German Jewish community, certain leaders in it recognized certainly their obligation to assist their poor benighted brethren in Russian Poland now that it's been occupied. But also there's a recognition that the Jews there would be a reliable and loyal population. Certainly there was no love lost between Poland's Jews and the Russian government. Jews were extremely useful in terms of providing services for, like they did it for the Russian military, they certainly could do it for the German military. And the Jews in Poland now enjoy very good relationships with the German military authorities, and are certainly see them as preferable to their former Russian overlords. With Polish nationalists, it's the reverse. The war begins with a lot of Polish nationalists seeing opportunities, right? Poland's partition and occupation was, brought about, through sort of the decision, the unity of the great powers, right, where Russia and Austria and Prussia all agreed to divide Poland. Well, now there's this huge split between those powers, and there's some hope on the part of Polish nationalists that somewhere in this conflict, an opportunity might arise for Poland to be reborn. One group of nationalists under, Pilsudski, they side with the Austro-Hungarians. Another group of nationalists under Roman Dmowski tend to side with at first the Russians and then later on with the French. So Polish nationalists are sort of playing both sides of this, hoping to get an opportunity there. By 1916, though, it becomes very clear that the Central Powers, at least in Eastern Europe, are winning, and that they're not interested in anything really resembling an independent Poland, right? There is some talk of some kind of satellite kingdom of Poland with some, perhaps a Habsburg or minor German royal family on the throne. But it's clear that the Germans, and it's worth pointing out, right? Again, by 1916, there's a feeling on both sides of the Great War that you got to get something out of this war, right? German military wants this now to be a war of real aggrandizement. They want to be able to go to their people and say, look, we rule Poland now, something big. In the summer of 1917, Pilsudski and his men are told they need to swear an oath of loyalty to Kaiser Wilhelm II. They refuse to do so, and Pilsudski is imprisoned, which works pretty well for him in another year or so when tide turns. And the war ends ultimately with actually this sort of remarkable blessing for Poland. Again, we talk about the miracles that go hand in hand with the formation of Israel. right? Imagine being a Polish nationalist in 1918, right? The end of 1918, where the war began with Poland divided between Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Russia. And the feeling is at some point, one side has got to win, right? You got to have one side or another that's in control. Remarkably, with the war's end, none of them win, right? Russia had surrendered in the beginning of 1918 to the Central Powers, so they were out of Poland, and the Central Powers surrendered to the West, right? And Poland finds itself in a situation where there is no great power authority anymore. And not only that, but the French are big advocates of Polish independence, and the Americans have come on as well, right? One of Wilson's 14 points, the 13th point specifically, calls for the creation of an independent Poland. But it's interesting when you look at the wording here, independent Polish state should be erected, which should include the territories inhabited by indisputably Polish population, right? And this is where things, of course, get tricky. What are those areas, right? What makes an area of indisputably Polish territory? And like the Balfour Declaration, right, this language is intentionally vague. There's a lot that's going to be left up to be resolved later on. It's designed to appeal to particular populations during wartime, without necessarily a lot of thought as to how this will be resolved when the war is over. And two big issues at the Paris Peace Conference. One is, what will Poland's borders be, right? So if you look over here on the map on the left, you have what's called the Curzon line. Lord Curzon was a British politician and diplomat who proposes, you know, sort of this bold line over here, and saying, look, everything on the left, that's the area which we can really say is Polish, right? To the right of that, that's where you start getting a tricky area of Lithuanians and Belarusians and Ukrainians. So there's a proposed, right, that the great part is that there will be a small Poland, largely Polish. And even there, though, there's still going to be Germans and certainly Jews and some Czechs and some Ukrainians and so forth. The other question then is minority rights, right? Because even in small Poland, you're going to have ethnic minorities and religious minorities. And, you know, the Jewish diplomats, or the diplomats on behalf of Jews, let's say, at the Paris Peace Conferences, make a very hard press that, look, we need guarantees for the Jews. Not just Jews, but certainly that's what they're pushing for. And so Poland, as well as the new countries formed, are obligated to sign these minorities treaties, right? No discrimination, state funding for schools in non-Polish language where demography demands, right? Meaning that in places where non-Poles represent a significant part of the population, they should have schools in their own languages paid for by the government. And Jews specifically would not be obligated to attend court on Shabbos. Elections should not be held on Shabbos. So in theory, it's supposed to be a smaller Poland where the rights of minorities are guaranteed. In practice, those things don't work out that way. And the 2 years after the Paris Peace Conferences, or 2-3 years or so, 1919, well, it begins in 1918, 18, 19, 20, a little into 21, Poland is beset by war, right? Some of this is war launched by Poland to expand its territory. Some of this is war launched by its neighbors. But basically, Poland fights Ukrainians, fights the Soviet Union, fights Lithuania, fights Czechoslovakia, fights various German militias. So, you know, massive conflict. And Jews find themselves in the midst of a lot of these conflicts. And it's one of these things where in a lot of these places, Jews find themselves on the wrong side of things. Polish nationalists believe, with some correct view, that many Jews preferred German to Polish rule or Austrian rule to Polish rule. Jews in the area of Lvov were accused of disloyalty, right? So again, Lvov is one of these mixed areas, Ukrainian and Polish, with a lot of Jews as well. Historically, the Jews there had favored the Polish side of things, but in the middle of this conflict, they don't know who's going to win. So they said, we'll stay neutral, which basically embittered both sides. In the Northeast, Jews tended to prefer Lithuanian rule, the general feeling being that because Lithuania was weaker, because they depended more on the goodwill of the great powers, they'd be far more willing to support the Jewish rights. And the fact that they were, right, Lithuania actually does treat Jews relatively well during the interwar period. And of course, with the invasion by the Soviets, you have the specter of what's called in Polish Żydo-komuna, right, Judeo-Bolshevism, right, the idea that the Jews favor the Bolsheviks, favor the Soviets, and can't be trusted. So as Poland finally takes form, Jews have found themselves, in a fairly bad place. And understand two things. One, Big Poland wins. Okay, Pilsudski takes command of the Polish military, wins a series of striking victories, ignores the Curzon line. And if you look at the map here, which is a Polish linguistic map of 1937, you can see that Poland expands far into the territory beyond just where Poles lived, which also means that this is a of minorities, right? At most, 70% of the population when it starts is Polish. And even that is generally viewed as high, right? It's an interesting thing if you look at the 1921 Polish Census. About 20% of Jews, it asks for religion, it asks for nationality. But 27% of the Jews who listed themselves as Jews by religion also listed themselves as Poles by nationality. So even when you look at that 70% of quote Poles, a number of them were actually other groups or that claimed Polish nationality for whatever reason. And interesting too, by the way, it wasn't just assimilated or acculturated Jews who identified as Poles by nationality, particularly down in Galicia. We don't know the numbers precisely, but it's assumed that significant numbers of Hasidim probably also identified as, minority, but still recognizable number, as Poles in response to their hostility to Zionism. Right, meaning that precisely because the Zionists said Jews are a nationality, Hasidic opponents of Zionism wanted to say, no, we're not a nationality, right, we're a religion. So anyway you look at it, Poland is a big state with a lot of minorities, and it's very clear that whatever treaties they signed, they're not going to obey them, right? They're not going to obey the treaties with their neighbors, and they're not going to obey a minorities treaty that they were forced to sign in the first place and that nobody's going to enforce. And thus, in 1921, Jews find themselves in this sort of like doubly vulnerable state, right? They're literally in a vulnerable state in a vulnerable state, right? Because Jews are a minority, right, in Poland. And Poland itself is in this sort of very fragile and vulnerable relationship with the larger world. And again, worth pointing out, when we compare this to Israel in 1948, right? Poland wins what many Poles would have seen as a miraculous victory, right? No less miraculous than what Jews saw in 1948 and 1949, right? After a century plus of heavy war, they defeat in the course of a number of years again. They beat the Czechs, they beat the Lithuanians, they beat Ukrainians, they beat Germans, and they beat the Soviet Union, right? Literally at the gates of Warsaw, right? The Miracle and the Vistula, as the Poles call it. So they survive, they even expand, right? Like Israel, they win more territory, but they know that they're surrounded by hostile states, right? Germany had no say in the Paris peace talks. The Soviet Union had no say in the Paris peace talks, right? So Poland finds itself surrounded by more powerful states, neither of which feel there's any legitimacy to Poland's existence, right? So much so that even in 1925, as part of sort of Weimar Germany's, restoration to the world, they signed something called the Treaty of Locarno, where they agree to recognize their borders with France and Belgium, right? Their western borders, but not to recognize their borders with Poland, right? That's still left open. And of course, Poland finds itself with a large group of minorities, many of whom might prefer to be in another country, right? You have Germans who would prefer to be part of Germany. You have Czechs. You have Lithuanians, right? Vilna, right? The great city of Lithuania ends up as part of Poland. Ukrainians might not want to be part of the Soviet Union, but they might want independence, right? So, you know, Poland finds itself, again, like Israel in 1949, victorious, but with a huge minority population, many of whom they recognize might prefer and be supportive of the large states neighboring them that, you know, want control. And at the same time, Poland feels itself as it's incomplete, right? So, you know, again, if you go back to this map here, right? Yeah, Poland is bigger than it was supposed to be, but in the same way that you're going to have, say, Israelis in 49 or 50 looking to the territories they didn't get, there are still Polish populations outside of Great Poland. And there are Polish nationalists who, again, looked to revanchism of their own to expand and so forth. And here you have, by the way, a series of different cartoons and images from Poland's neighbors, anti-Polish cartoons depicting, right, corrupt or vicious or dangerous Poles. This one is a Polish revanchist cartoon calling for Poles to sort of reclaim their lost lands and so forth. So understand, while certainly in Poland in the war period, there's traditional anti-Judaism, traditional anti-Semitism, there's also the specific conditions of Poland itself, right? Where you have a Jewish question, which itself is part of the larger nationalities question, right? Poland's minorities, which itself is part of the to some unresolved Polish question, right? All very complicated. And complicating this further is, of course, you don't have just one Jewry in Poland, right? It's not, you know, 1700 anymore. There are several fairly distinct Jewries. Some of this has to do with the fact that, again, Polish Jewry was divided by the three different, you know, ruling states. But also the religious differences, political differences, cultural differences that made up Polish Jewry, right? There's Jewish politics, right? There are the multiple Zionist parties, which collectively were the largest faction. The Bund, which started off fairly weak in Poland, but gained strength by the late 1930s. And it's an interesting thing, to some extent. You see the same development in Polish Jewry by 1939 that you saw in Germany in 1932, right? Where the mainstream parties, having failed to resolve their problems, Polish Jews tended to move to the left and the right. Both the Zionist revisionists gaining power and the Bund gaining power, right? Agudas Yisrael, probably the largest single party, but even there were important religious figures who did not join Agudas Yisrael. There's the external politics, right? Should you ally with the other minorities, right? Should you curry favor with the Polish government, right? And there's advantage, right? Maybe if you join with the Ukrainians and Belarusians in what's called the minorities bloc, maybe you can collectively get more done. But maybe by doing that, you antagonize the Polish regime. Should you demand equality? Should you call for more modest goals, right? Like the Agudas Yisrael, which tended to take a more traditional view, sort of like what they did in Israel in the first decades, of saying, listen, we want to maintain our religious life. We want to strengthen our religious institutions. We don't care that much about equality or emancipation or voting because, you know, not our thing. Jewish culture, again, you have three different language blocks, right? Polonizers, Hebraizers, Yiddishists, also just regular Jews. The Polish government did not create public schools in Yiddish, and so there you had several networks of Jewish schools. There were the Tarbut schools, which were Zionist. You had the Fisho schools, I think, which were Yiddishist, associated with sort of the Bundist view of things. You had, of course, the religious schools, traditional schools like Beis Yaakov and Chorev, which were the most popular among Jews. But even there, by the end of the 1930s, probably about 60% of Jewish kids in Poland were attending public Polish language schools. So it's an interesting thing, right? When you look at the classic photographs of Polish Jewry in the late 1930s by Roman Vishniak, you know, you get this impression that Jewish life was like static and frozen in amber. But understand, Vishniak was specifically photographing, right, old Jewish life, right? I mean, he was trying to capture this sort of, Hasidic world, and wasn't trying to capture sort of this more acculturating world. And again, there were religious kids, I'm sure, going to public schools because they were free, right? I mean, we shouldn't make the mistake of assuming that, for example, a vote for the Bund meant that you were a radical. Bundists went to shul, Orthodox Jews voted for the Bund, right? All of these things exist side by side, right? An Orthodox Jew who votes for the Bund because they're fighting to improve working conditions and get you off on Shabbos. Right? There's all kinds of things that are going to work here.
In North America too.
Yeah, right. I mean, I think we for various reasons, again, we have sort of people develop this idea of like, you have the secularists and the ultra-Orthodox, and look at any shul, right? I mean, you're going to find all this stuff, right, still existing side by side. And obviously there's the social element, right? There's the old, sort of joke like Silverstein and Goldberg, where Silverstein is the atheist, Goldberg is the Ehrlich Yid. They both go to shul on Shabbos, and somebody says to Silverstein, right, I don't understand, right? I get why Goldberg comes to shul. He talks to God. Why do you come to shul? I talk to Goldberg, right? Which I think captures something important about these societies, right? And look, I always think it's very interesting, when you meet older Hasidim, they're far more comfortable with the non-Hasidic world, right? Because they grew up in neighborhoods that weren't Hasidic neighborhoods. I'm talking about Williamsburg. I'm talking about Crown Heights. They grew up in Jewish neighborhoods with Hasidim, but they're far more integrated in the larger Jewish world, right? And that's the reality, right? I mean, we've had this weird sort of move in another direction, but certainly back in pre-war Poland, you didn't have Orthodox neighborhoods, right? You had lots of Jewish neighborhoods and entire Jewish towns, right? But that meant that all these people were existing side by side very often in the same family. All of these groups and ideologies had their own newspapers, their own publishing companies, theaters, cultural organizations. All the different Zionist factions had and religious had youth groups, right? So all this stuff existed, right, side by side. And I sort of way of looking at it, in 1929, you had a Hungarian Jewish woman who won Miss Europe, a Austrian Jewish woman, Liesl Arbeiter, won Miss Universe, which is not the same Miss Universe as today, although they took the name. And so in Poland, in Warsaw, the main secular, not secular, I should say, the main Polophone, Polish language Jewish newspaper, Nasz Prgląd, decided they would have their own beauty pageant, Miss Judea, where you would have the woman who best exemplified Polish Jewish beauty, which clearly they were specifically looking for, right, brunettes of a certain Semitics, right? And the winner, Sophia Oldock, they made reference to her, right, Sparty features, which just looks like a Jew to me. But, this is happening in Warsaw where, guess what, the traditional rabbinic authority is not happy with this. Right? All this stuff is existing side by side. Polish Jewry was not in any way a monolith, right? Now, it's important to note that all of these changes are taking place, of course, in a Poland which itself is undergoing major transformation. And look, Jews, as I mentioned before, they're affected by whatever's going on around them. Poland was poor, which meant that most Jews were going to be poor as well. Even Greater Poland was smaller and weaker than the states it replaced. And it's one of those things when people talk about nationalism, none of these people really give a lot of thought to the economic implications of what they're doing, right? You look through all Eastern Europe and what happens after World War I is all of these national groups, which have been part of these huge economies, very closely integrated economies, now find themselves in much smaller, weaker economies, right? Countries that are dependent on coal from this area and iron from that area and selling their own goods to another area suddenly find that all those areas are gone, right? Right. For example, in Poland, the garment industry had been in pre-war Poland a huge part of both the national, sort of the Polish economy, but also specifically the Polish Jewish economy. Well, yeah, of course, they were selling those garments to the larger Russian Empire, which they're now closed off from. Right? So even forgetting about the economic impact of the war, after the war, Poland, like its neighbors, finds itself a much smaller and weaker economy. A large percentage of the Jewish population was impoverished by the war. Something like, there are some like a third of the population of Poland, Jews in Poland, were on some sort of, between a quarter and a third, on some sort of charitable relief. And understand, for decades, a safety valve for Polish Jewry, both in Galicia and in Russian Empire, had been emigration. By 1924, most of that shut off. Jews are not able to really emigrate to, I mean, some can go to Germany, but the German economy was very fragile. You don't have a lot of Jews migrating there. The United States shuts off most immigration from Poland in 1924. Even Palestine, because of economic requirements there, but it means that there aren't a whole lot of places that Polish Jews can go. And that means that safety valve is gone, also increasingly money sent from abroad is gone as well. 1926, Pilsudski, who had stepped out of politics after winning his victories, comes back in, right? Poland was falling apart. He comes in, launches a military coup, takes over. And for the next decade or so, Pilsudski is more or less a military dictator. This is seen as a pretty good time for Polish Jews as much as anything goes. Pilsudski was not an anti-Semite, but he was an assimilationist, right? In his view, Jews should remain, he doesn't care if they're religious, but they should identify with the Polish nationality, right? What he wants is a Polonized Jewry. And so, you know, even though Jews are not persecuted under Pilsudski, the various Jewish parties don't get any of the goals they wanted. They don't get funding for their schools. They don't get specific aid for the Jewish poor, you know, any of the things that they wanted, or any sensitivity to Jewish concerns. But at the very least, they're physically protected. He had stamped down some of the anti-Semitic movements in Poland, and for about a decade, sort of Polish Jewry is at least safe, right? But by the mid-1930s, everything falls apart. Pilsudski dies in 1935. By that point, the Great Depression has hit Poland, and the success of Nazism is a disaster for the Jews in Eastern and Central Europe in general, right? I mean, you know, people are seeing that, hey, you know, there's no penalty from the larger world community for anti-Semitism. And even though, again, you know, most Polish political and religious leaders, the respectable types, reject physical violence against Jews. They almost entirely, with the exception of the Polish Socialist Party, which had been Pilsudski's party, accept the notion that Poland had too many Jews and their Jews were too powerful. Right? Again, Polish leaders called for the development of Polish cooperatives, right? That farmers need to set up their own cooperatives so they don't have to buy and sell through the Jews. They call for boycott of Jewish businesses, right? And understand here, right? Jews had a, yeah, right. But this is Poles for Poland for Poles, or Poland, yeah. That Jews represented a very important niche in the Polish economy. But one which, again, theoretically, was unnecessary. Here, by the way, is a statement from Cardinal August Lond, who was the lead Catholic figure in Poland at the time. I warn against the fundamental unconditional imported from abroad, right? It is contrary to Catholic ethics. It is permissible to love one nation more. It is not permissible to hate anyone, not even Jews. One does well, that, by the way, if you're a weird moaning son, that's my dog. One does well to prefer his own kind of commercial dealings and to avoid Jewish stores and Jewish stalls in the markets. But it is not permissible to ransack Jewish businesses, destroy their merchandise, break windows, blow up their houses. One ought to fence oneself off against the harmful moral influences of Judaism, separate themselves from anti-Christian culture, and especially boycott the Jewish press and the demoralizing Jewish publications. It is not permissible to assault Jews, to hit, maim, or burn them. So look, this is one of those things which, you know, good for him, I guess, but it highlights the fact that this stuff is happening, right? And it's worth pointing out again, that not uncommonly, when you have moments like we have in America today, you're going to have people who, of course, they don't mean harm to illegal immigrants or immigrants, and you can express it in a reasonable way, but language matters, right? The language we use, even if we believe we are being, generous. I'm sure Cardinal Hahn thought this is great, right? You shouldn't eat. Not even Jews should be beaten, right? But obviously, it's a bit damning with faint praise, whatever it may be. But the point is that Jews are facing now not just anti-Jewish violence, which bad enough by itself, but that violence is often a tool of the boycott, right? And it's not just Jews, right? Non-Jews are also attacked for violating the boycott, right? You're going to have members of Piast, which is the Peasants' Party, the Index, the National Democrats, who are going to stand in front of Jewish stalls and businesses, who are going to harass customers. They will sometimes attack Jews. They'll sometimes attack non-Jews who make use of that. Interesting, again, sort of study here showed that 11 towns in the Bialystok region in 1932, 663 shops were owned by Jews. That constituted 90% of the total. By 1937, there are 553 shops owned by Jews, which is only 64.5% of the total, because two things are taking place. At the same time that there are efforts made to, again, boycott the Jews, there are also efforts made, again, to encourage people to go to Christian merchants or Polish merchants, set up cooperatives and all this stuff. And it is, again, I think it's interesting in our own understanding of things as Jews. Look, I will say quite reasonably, if I have a choice, all things being equal, between a guy who's a businessman who's Shomer Shabbos and one who's not, I'll go with the Shomer Shabbos guy, right? I mean, we want to give business to Jews. We want to give business to Israel, right? Certainly in Israel, there are no shortage of Israelis who would advocate buy from Israeli Jews and not from Israeli Arabs, right? And so again, it is worth considering, obviously being on the receiving end of this stuff, terrible, right? But it's an idea we should understand, right? Because it's an idea which I think a lot of us embrace ourselves. Yeah. And it's actually funny, looking at what's taking place in Poland in this time period, is in the first half of the 20th century, Jewish nationalism, which we call Zionism, and Polish nationalism make this sort of weird zigzag, okay, where both felt their nations were unhealthy and incomplete, right? If you look at the socialist Zionists and various others, they would say, look, there's something wrong with the Jews. We're an abnormal people. Right? Why are we abnormal? We don't work the land, right? We need to work our own soil and our own land. Only when we're doing all this stuff, and there's Chaim Nachman Bialik's, right, famous sort of idea that when the first Hebrew prostitute or Hebrew thief, depending which version you see, is arrested by the first Hebrew cop and brought before the first Hebrew judge, then we'll be normal, right? Then Zionism will be successful, right? When you're doing all this stuff for yourself, right? When you have the full range of things. Well, at the same time that the Zionists are saying Jews need to leave the city and go and work the land and become agriculturalists, in Poland, Polish nationalists are doing the reverse. They're saying, hey, we're also abnormal, right? We're abnormal because we don't live in our own cities, right? Because we don't run our own stores, because we don't run our own businesses, right? Only, right, when we do that, then we'll be a normal, healthy society. So you have, again, this kind of like weird thing where they want us to basically. And, the feeling is that, there are simply too many Jews in Poland and they have too much influence. The successor regime to Pilsudski, made up of military figures and various other parties, wants to end Poland's Jewish problem with the migration of some 90% of Poland's Jewish population. Right. Again, the problem is where they're going to go. The Poles went to their allies, the French, said, "Could we look at Madagascar?" Right. Which, interestingly, a decade earlier, the Poles had looked to Madagascar as an outlet for Polish agricultural colonists, but they do send a delegation to Madagascar to check to its suitability for Jewish migrants. Very little comes of that, or nothing comes of that. Even the Poles in the delegation believe that at most 50,000 Jews can migrate. Of course, Polish anti-Semites' greatest allies in the 1930s in terms of their idea of getting rid of the Jews in Poland. Who do you think that would be? Who in Poland shared with Polish anti-Semites the mutual goal of getting the Jews out of Poland?
Zionist.
The Zionists, all right? Particularly the Zionist revisionists, Jabotinsky's. And again, this is one of those things that sounds weird to us. But again, understand, even from the beginning in Judenstaat, where Herzl talks about the benefits of Zionism, one of the things he says is everybody benefits. The anti-Semites benefit because they get rid of the Jews. The Jews benefit because they get away from the anti-Semites. Right? This is a long-standing thing here. Here's Jabotinsky visiting Pilsudski's grave. And look, I'm not saying this is like something wrong with Zionism. It makes perfect sense, right? The Jabotinsky wants to achieve what the Poles have done. They want to get the Jews out to their own place so they can be safe. They want to build a state like Poland had. The Poles themselves see two things in mind. On the one hand, we'll get rid of the Jews. But there's also this sort of weird Polish idea that creating a Jewish state in Palestine will give Poland this sort of almost imperialist street cred, right? That if they can assist the Jews in this goal, if Jabotinsky is successful, there will be a Jewish state in Palestine, which will be sympathetic to Poland, which will have ties to Poland, which can be sort of an expression of Polish influence. And so the Polish military and intelligence sets up training schools for the revisionists. Here you see some Zionist revisionists, and you see the map of Eretz Yisrael in the background there. Training with weapons. So, right, Jabotinsky's people were in the same way, by the way, that they got training from the fascists in Italy. And I'm not saying this critically. They were also getting training from the right-wing anti-Semitic, government in Poland because, right, of sort of this mutual interest that they all had. And ultimately, of course, the fate of Poland's Jews should not be up to them nor their Polish neighbors, right? As we're going to see next week, all the questions, what happens to Poland and what happens to Poland's Jews, are really in the hands of, right, higher powers, namely the Soviets and the Germans. And with that, I'm happy to address questions. If nobody has questions, I'm happy to say goodnight and go and have dinner.
No, I just wanted to comment.
Yeah.
I grew up in a black hat synagogue. There was a gentleman who came every Yom Kippur. His parents were founders of the synagogue. He was a member, this was in Canada, he was a member of provincial parliament for the Communist Party in the 40s into the early 50s. But he was one of the leaders of the Communist Party. After Khrushchev's speech, he became a socialist. But he came every year to say Yizkor for his parents. He was accepted. Like, they wouldn't like to talk about reform or conservative. The rabbi wouldn't like to use those words even, reform or conservative. But this guy was accepted. He was kicked out of his parents' house when he was 19 because he joined Left Polei Zion. Like, I guess it'd be equivalent to Mapam nowadays. But he was accepted. And many traditional Jews and Orthodox Jews apparently voted for him in the 40s because he was seen as anti-Nazi, he was seen as pro-Jewish, and they might have been anti-communist, but they voted for him.
That's what happens with the Bund in 1938. So the Bund through the interwar period was pretty weak in Poland. They never elected a delegate to the parliament. But then in 1938, suddenly they elect like 61% of, they get like 61% of the vote from Jews in the Warsaw City Council. And the general feeling was that, it's not because suddenly 61% of Warsaw's Jews were Verbrechtebundists, right? But because many of them, young people in particular, who felt that the old politics were failing, right? Look, it's like looking at America today, right? And the feeling of young people that like you need more radical choices. So yeah, right. And I'm sure that in the election before that they voted for somebody else. And look, do you guys know who Nathan Birnbaum is? Not George Burns, which is also his name, but the original Nathan Birnbaum.
Yiddish
Okay,
culture.
well,
And then
Nathan, I mean, to me, he defined, like, he's like a microcosm of the East European Jewish experience. Nathan Birnbaum in the 1890s is a member of Hovei Tzion. He's the one who coins the term Zionism, right? Then, as you point out, by 1908 or whatever it is, he becomes an advocate of Yiddishism. And then he ends his life as a ultra-Orthodox anti-Zionist. right? Meaning that you have this tremendous breadth of ideological and religious ferment among Eastern European Jewry, and a lot of Jews sort of run the gamut even in the course of a few years. Anyone else?
Yes. I think you spoke well about the cultural complexity and also the linguistic complexity. You very well put together how complex the picture of what languages Jews were speaking, between Polish assimilation, between Yiddish, between the Zionists encouraging Hebraism and so on, just for the top layer of it. But I'd like to say a couple of things. One is,
Sure.
I think that the percentage of Jewish kids in the interwar period who were attending Polish language public schools was even higher than the large number that you quoted. I think the percentages are remarkably high, actually, because as you say, they were free. They provided reasonable education and were free. I think that by the late 1930s, it was around 90% of the Jewish kids going to one of those. I've seen that figure
my
quoted.
citation is Ezra Mendelsohn, Jews in East Central Europe between the wars, which doesn't mean that he's right. I'm just giving you the citation.
Right. But I've seen even higher figures quoted. The other thing, along the same
Well, I
line,
will say, hold on, but the numbers that they gave were about 100,000 Jews in the religious schools and about 50,000 in the Yiddishist and Zionist schools. So,
right.
So, I mean, if those numbers,
what I'm saying. Yeah.
Sorry.
And I'd like to also mention an important language cultural influence were summer camps. And it's interesting what happened there. So summer camps, everybody ran summer camps for the Jewish kids. They weren't all summer. I mean, the communities couldn't afford to send it away. The parents couldn't afford to send the kid for the whole summer. Tip kid go a couple of weeks, and then there'd be another bunch of kids that would come in. And all the different Jewish movements, brought in wave after wave of kids every 2 weeks or another group. But it's interesting to think about what languages did they use. So, of course, the Bundist camps used Yiddish because they were Yiddishists, right? What language did the Zionist camps use? So that's where it gets funny. The Zionist camps would have loved to use, they weren't going to use Yiddish because that wasn't their language, right? They would have loved to use Hebrew. Not enough people, not enough kids knew Hebrew well enough to use it. So the Zionist camps were dafka done in Polish in order not to do it in Yiddish.
it makes
Polish
sense.
was the only other alternative. That illustrates the complexity of the picture. Anyway, thank you very much.
And even, by the way, it gets more complex in terms of relationship with the Polish government, meaning like the Polish government was far more concerned about Yiddish in, for example, the western part of Poland or central Poland, where the Poles were, than they were about Yiddish in eastern Poland, where the Ukrainians and Belarusians, right? Because they're the Jews might be seen as allies against the others. Anyone else?
Thank you for a lecture, really wonderful lecture.
Thank you. Well, next week we'll be discussing Polish-Jewish relations during the war itself. So God willing, you'll show up and we'll have another wonderful class. Yeah. But take care.
Thank you, David. Thank
Yeah,
you.
good night.
Thank you, David.
Thank you, David.
Well, be safe,
Thank you,
everyone.
David.
Good night.
Thank you, David.
תודה רבה.
I know.